Thank you all for attending the GCC Net Measure event. We're so excited about the mission and vision of the Global Center for Cyber, and we're so glad you're with us for this event. I've got an literally unbelievable panel of some great cyber minds together from across the globe. And they're going to share some insights with us on cyber and the topic of government-private partnership and how that can affect cybersecurity outcomes. Why don't I go ahead and give a brief bio for each one of our great panelists, and then we'll jump right into it. So first, Phil Riley. Phil, thanks for joining us. Phil is a former CIA officer and ran Special Activities Division for the CIA. He was the senior U.S. intelligence representative to the United Kingdom during the 2012 London Olympics. Pretty spectacular stuff. He actively advises U.S. and foreign companies in the cybersecurity arena. Thanks, Phil, for joining us. Steve Hill. Steve's currently the head of Operational Resilience and Threat Integration at Credit Suisse and a senior visiting fellow at King's College of London. Steve previously served over 30 years in the British government, including the National Security Secretariat, countering transnational threats such as terrorism and proliferation. Thanks for joining us, Steve. Patty McGinnis. Patty was Deputy National Security Advisory covering security, intelligence, and resilience with two successive British prime ministers. His lead on what American audience would call Homeland Security, including cybersecurity and crisis response. He now addresses threats and manages resilience in support of listed companies. So thanks, Patty, for joining us. Also joined by Chris Inglis. Chris is former Deputy Director of the National Security Agency, currently serving as the Looker Distinguished Visiting Professor of Cyber Studies at the United States Naval Academy, and a commissioner on the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission charged with mapping out U.S. national cyber strategy. Chris is also a managing director at Paladin Capital Group, a director of the boards for FedEx and Huntington Bank, and a member of U.S. Defense Science Board. So thanks for joining us, Chris. And lastly, joined by the Honorable James Clapper. He served as the fourth U.S. Director of National Intelligence from August 9, 2010 through January 20, 2017. In this position, Mr. Clapper led the United States intelligence community and served as the principal intelligence advisor to President Barack Obama. Thanks for joining us, General. It's great to have you, and great to have such a distinguished panel for the topic at hand around government-private sector partnerships. So let's just jump right in. And again, thank you all for joining us. I can't wait to get the feedback from our panelists on these topics. So first, do you feel it's fair to say that to counter cyber threats requires both government and private sector enterprises to work in partnership? Explore this a little deeper. We've been talking about this for years. How can we work on this to really make a lasting improvement?
So I'll open on that. I think I'd start with 3 points, and in each of these points, there's a little bit of good news, a little bit of sobering news, a little bit of bad news. First, there's a growing awareness on part of both the government and the private sector, particularly in Western democracies, that the problem of cyberspace, the challenges, the aggressors, the things that go boom in the night are getting worse, and at a scope and scale that is worrisome. And we see increasingly, while 85% of what's taking place in that space is attributable to criminals, increasingly the nation states that occupy about 14% of the number of events are having a disproportionate impact. That's the bad news of that first point. The good news that then comes out of that is they increasingly see that they have common cause and that they're going to have to figure out how they collaborate, how they integrate their efforts to address that. That leads to the second point, which is in considering that integration or collaboration, the private and the public sector clearly recognize that their tools are different. Sometimes even their time scale is different. What they focus on is their priorities. But having said that, the diversity of those tools covers the waterfront. And if you put those together in the right way, you might just get a united front that's considerably more capable than either side could muster alone. Within the United Kingdom, there's something called the National Cyber Security Center. If you come out of Victoria Station, look straight ahead at a gleaming new building, you're probably looking at that center. And if you were to walk in, you would see shoulder to shoulder folks from the private sector and the public sector. The UK's version of my parent agency, the National Security Agency, so GCHQ, and private sector representatives, shoulder to shoulder, co-discovering, co-mitigating threats on the fly. Now, while that might sound like a drop in the bucket, how could they possibly get their arms around everything that's happening in that space? It's remarkable what that effect is off that floor. The relationships that are established on that floor can then enrich the stovepipes that are off that floor, and having a propensity to collaborate at the kind of the discovery of some of these things that then extends back into the rest of their operations to have at least a possible bias for collaboration. We're currently in the United States studying that strategy and some others. The United States Cyberspace Solarium Commission is trying to recommend, and we've lit on this possibility, hopefully a probability, that if we have meaningful integration, private-public collaboration, will make a profound difference in the outcomes that adversaries heretofore have achieved with impunity. That then leads me to the third point, which is we need to set expectations. Both sides are going to have a role. Frankly, individuals, sectors, private and public, governments, plural, all have a role. And we need to put those together in a way that are complementary. Two, the government's not going to be able to solve all the problems of the private sector. So as a board member at FedEx, we well appreciate we operate in some interesting places. Some might say risky places, but that's where the business is. We have to make investments required to have a sufficient resilience and robustness that we can have confidence that those are well-placed kind of business imperatives. But if at some point we come up against a nation state that holds us at risk, we have an expectation we're going to have a partner in government, or governments plural. That then kind of begets that in this space, we're not going to defend our patches alone, simply those things that we own. We're going to try to figure out how to lock arms and make it such that if you're an adversary in this space, you've got to beat all of us to beat one of us. Now, that's a pithy, possibly Pollyannish phrase, but if we can strive to move in that direction, I think we'll be in a much better place.
Those are really interesting perspectives and very thoughtful insights. General Clapper, what's your view on that?
Well, we're working better. This is a journey that doesn't have an end really, because there's always room for improvement. Having seen this from both sides, both the government and the non-government domains, you have to remember simple observation that the government doesn't control the internet. So there has to be a partnership. Having said that, there are certain inhibitions in both camps, both government and non-government, that prevent full and open and complete transparency. And they are understandable and appropriate. From the standpoint of the government, it's always the issue of protecting sources, methods, and tradecraft. And from the standpoint of industry, it's oftentimes a proprietary or liability issue that's at play. So I think people have to understand those constraints that are legitimate on both sides and attempt to work through them. I think as we've seen recent attacks, SolarWinds comes to mind, I think that will probably do more to impel cooperation and collaboration between the government and the non-government sector than anything else, when we understand the magnitude of the threat that's posed both ways and both camps. The Congress has tried to legislate this. I was involved in an effort or watched an effort on the part of the Senate Intelligence Committee some years ago, and that fell flat in the Congress. So I think the greatest catalyst, the greatest motivation is a realization of the common threat faced by both government and non-government entities. And for that matter, if I might, this applies as well to our foreign partners, since cyber, as you well know, doesn't recognize nation-state borders. So this is a problem or an issue for, I'll call it the coalition of the willing. So that's another dimension of sharing.
That's really insightful. Patty, Steve, what do you guys think? Do you agree?
So I think the way that Chris has laid that out is a wonderful aspiration. I was involved at the outset in the establishment of the National Cybersecurity Centre, working for Prime Minister Cameron at the time. And it's a great step forward. It's 5 years since we did that. And I think we have to ask ourselves, have we got 5 years of improvement? And I think we probably haven't. So I do think it's a moment to think about what are the issues that make it difficult for government and industry to collaborate. Now, where it is relatively straightforward is when you have an attack by a nation state, and it clearly is an attack, an intrusion, a presence by a nation state. And we're having this panel discussion in the shadow of the United States-led response to the SolarWinds intrusion and exploitation of software on which many of us rely. And that response and that leadership is really welcome. So nation states, that's relatively straightforward. I think the difficulty is that, of course, the majority of intrusions and exploitation of networks is being done by criminals for financial gain. And government, certainly in the United Kingdom, is determined that its investment in core cybersecurity for the heart of the national security state shouldn't become the nation's IT help desk. And it isn't only in Europe that there's concern. One of the reasons why business, including critical national infrastructure, is vulnerable is because there's an underinvestment or there isn't sufficient focus upon the requirements of security, whether that be national security against nation states or it simply be the corrosive effect of criminality. And of course, the two often operate in partnership. And I think we've seen a really interesting thing happen over recent years, and there's an acceleration at the moment, certainly in the European Union, which of course regards itself as a regulatory superpower, whatever you think of that as a phrase. And that is that government is defining clearly what it is going to do and what it's not going to do. And the way in which it's defining what it's not going to do is by regulation. And regulation has a really interesting effect on collaboration, because usually the institutions that interact with business for government are in some way involved in the regulation, whether they be the National Cybersecurity Centre, which provides the advice behind regulation, or it be individual bits of the British or individual European states, or indeed the European Union, that have an interaction with business. They usually have some regulatory role, and that rather flavors the interaction. They begin to tell. I think the thing that Solarium Commission did so wonderfully is it captured the idea of what business should be doing for itself in a patriotic way, and the way in which it should aspire to have much better and potentially machine speed situational awareness of what is going on critical networks in business, but for business purposes, not just for government. Steve will have a close perspective on this coming out of the finance sector, which of course is one of the most heavily regulated, both by those concerned with financial stability and those concerned by network systems.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I agree with everything that Chris and Paddy have said, but I'd maybe even go a little bit further, which is whilst there is a confluence of interest at one level, there are also some quite interesting misalignments. So whereas government will typically, I think, take a sort of systemic, longer term view, as soon as you go into the private sector, you see not quite the tyranny of the shareholder and the customer, but that's the priority. And those two things won't always exactly line up. So if I take the example of paying ransoms after a ransomware attack, it's very clear from a government perspective that this is not helpful. It fuels an ecosystem of criminals, encourages them, actually funds them to find more exploits. This is a bad thing. But if you're sitting in a company, where it's a bank or perhaps kind of more vividly a hospital, suddenly the equation may look a little bit different, because both ethically and legally, maybe, and in terms of protecting your shareholder value, perhaps paying the ransom is actually the right thing to do. And I think that's an interesting conflict there that I'm not sure that we've managed to work out what the right way forward is. I also wonder whether there is a sense that the government agencies sometimes maybe don't strike quite the right balance between offense and defense. It's great to be developing lots of new zero-day exploits which you can use in a hybrid warfare situation. but there are downsides to that, and we've seen with something like Eternal Blue what happens when they get out into the wild. And so I think from a government perspective, that equilibrium between offense and defense is a particularly interesting one. And there are some things that if you're sitting in a private enterprise, you can't do. We see most of these criminal gangs, which are the ones that we worry about, operating from jurisdictions that we can't reach. And only governments can have that influence there. And I guess there's a question for whether enough is being done there. And we've seen recently new sanctions, but we've been doing that for the last 5-10 years, and it hasn't really changed the balance of advantage. The current equilibrium, the public-private collaboration partnership, I'm not sure whether we're winning as fast as we need to. And as we move faster and faster towards this digital economy that the last year has accelerated even more, we still seem to be playing catch up. And that can't be where we are. Phil, I mean, what is that your sense, Phil, or Paddy?
So before Phil comes in, can I just pick up on two things that Steve has said? And the first one is, I'm afraid to say, when I'm with businesses in the middle of a cyber crisis, in particular a ransomware crisis, and they sometimes naively turn to me and say, oh, we really must go to law enforcement, or we must go to the National Cybersecurity Center and they will help us. I have to tell them that unfortunately Ronald Reagan is right, that in many situations the most frightening sentence is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. And I'm afraid to say that if you lay out all of the government agencies and figures, including legislators and political leaders in office, and look what they will do for a shareholder value company when it is subject to a non-state or something that isn't proven to be a state cyber intrusion, the answer is very little that really helps a company in the short to medium term. Law enforcement doesn't, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to say national cyber centers don't. I'm afraid to say legislators tend to be blamestorming and looking for whom to blame. And they can have profoundly corrosive effect upon the workforce, which of course is the thing you most need to respond when you're subjected to a major network system event. And then Steve brought out this tension between offense and defense. And I've recently been in the British press making the argument that I'm afraid to say we've just had an integrated review in the UK of our security and defense policy. And I'm afraid to say it doesn't explain how we're going to make ourselves sufficiently strong at home to be able to truly use the offensive tools that the program, which I oversaw some years ago, introduces. And I think that's going to be a constant strain when we think about offense and being able to campaign in this new domain. And Chris has done some great work both on the theory and the practice of this. We've got to be able to defend at home, and that's about actually your workforce and the way they think about it and the way they think about what their responsibility is, knowing that, as I do, and I think other people on the panel do, the government isn't a cavalry that's going to come in and help them. They're going to have to look after their own networks and fight their own corner, and they've got to have that mindset. Sorry, Phil, I interrupted you very rudely.
If I could just build on that for 2 quick points. I know we need to get on to some other speakers as well, but I think to Patty's point, when the government is called on these events, say a ransomware has just taken place, part of the reason why the government is powerless to do something is you have to actually go back 2 months or 3 months or 6 months in order to stop it at its incipient phase. We need to actually move left of the event and try to find ways to stop it. What the government can be doing is not showing up and magically restoring the information, but removing the conditions that give safe harbor to these criminal elements, and in some cases nation states, right, who happen to front as criminal elements, remove those conditions such that we have an enduring effect on the probability that this is going to happen again.
Yeah, I could chime in on the idea of the public-private partnership. I think a lot of work needs to be done. I think we've heard some examples of that in the last few minutes. But one of the examples I think where there's a positive sign is FS-ISAC, right, dealing with the financial institutions of the United States. Some would say that's a partial success. In 2016, there was an offshoot organization called the FSR, the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resilience Center, created by the 8 largest U.S. banks. And they're designed to protect the financial institutions and infrastructure of the United States. Now, cyber is not the only threat, obviously, to the financial institutions, but it is the principal threat. And this particular platform is very unique in that FBI, Homeland Security, Treasury, and other government agencies are embedded with it and working with it closely. I've never seen that type of interaction in a public-private partnership. Now, I think this has been a huge success because only 3 months ago, the FS part of the ARC went away. Now it's just the Analysis and Resilience Center because the U.S. power sector has joined their financial sector colleagues in this organization. So I think that's an example for other sectors of the U.S. economy to work together much more closely with the U.S. government. The other area I just want to bring up is in terms of public-private partnership, and I think is a real issue area, is I seem to think some of the best cyber experts come out of the U.S. government, and that's not to insult people in the audience who may not have a government background, but I think to intimately know the offensive and defensive capabilities of the most sophisticated enemies is critical. The problem with that is you agree with me, and I'm talking to the audience now, because you're recruiting these people in numbers that the U.S. government is hemorrhaging, and we cannot replace them. So we need to improve upon not only retention, but have an ability for people to move in and out of the government much more readily. Now, that's not a novel idea. We've been doing that, and the government's trying to do that for many years, but not with great success. There's a lot of reasons. There's security reasons, and they're not invalid ones. There's huge salary disincentives, but the public-private partnership has to work together to make that going back and forth much, much easier, because neither the public or the private sector has the bench strength to do what we need to do in the cyber area alone.
Yeah, Phil, those are really great points, and I can tell you guys, as being an operator, a CISO for over 20 years, mostly in banking and finance, you really had to build your organizations as if you were going to be alone. So it's almost like if you could have invested greater time up front with getting closer to key government allies where you're doing business, so that flow of not only information but capability was there in the time of need. That's important because when it comes to the nation state threat, every corporation's at a massive disadvantage. And, Chris, I know you've got some deep insights there, but that nation threat has always been one for, much of our audience as well as myself. How do we deal with it and how do we handle it going forward?
Yeah, so let me just build on the conversation that's taken place so far, which is the good news, bad news is that people and doctrine are integral parts of what you might describe as cyberspace. People and doctrine, meaning roles and responsibilities, are integrally connected to how that technology performs. And I will tell you, my experience to take advantage of frailty in that space is that more often than not, to a high degree, they're taking advantage of weaknesses in people and weaknesses in doctrine. Are the roles and responsibilities set right? Classically, in a lot of organizations, the people authorized to take risk, extending digital infrastructure into odd places, aren't the people who have to then mitigate that risk. And so there's a tail chase being played. So if you get those latter two parts right, that's the good news. You get those latter two parts right, it makes a substantial difference even before you begin to invest in the technology. In terms of the third wave of cyber attacks, first wave might be an attack on data and systems. The second wave might be on the critical functions dependent on that. We're now experiencing a third wave, which is an attack on confidence that we have that digital infrastructure will serve our purposes. I've heard that characterized as wetware attacks. Can they isolate individuals? Can they convince an individual something's true, or some bias might be perhaps the kind of standard line of thinking that they might not otherwise have thought? Do that at scale and you have influence ops. Nation states are engaged in all of those activities, and to the degree that they've done that with impunity, they're only doing more of it. If you think about the security kind of statement of a Russia, they know they can't win head-to-head contest. They're certainly not going to try to effect a military competition, but they might try a competition using all the instruments of power at their disposal. And they realize that in that asymmetric contest, that cyberspace gives them a unique advantage, not least of which is you can do a lot of things in cyberspace without tripping a head-to-head conflict, without tripping something that might garner them the undivided attention of a Western competitor. So they believe that peacetime, if there is such a thing, is the decisive phase, and they have used that to their stunning advantage. As we'd indicated earlier, you're not going to completely remove mischief from the field. Cost of entry is too low. The ability to attribute in time to do something about that, as if you're smacking the hand of a child sticking it into a candy jar, those things make it difficult. But you can affect the decision calculus of those adversaries. You can make it clear that we're a harder target. You're going to have to spend more to succeed. You can make it clear that we're going to be paying attention to who's doing what, and we will align action. And then finally, coalitions, that's a stunning advantage that the West has. We tend to have allies, others have partners. Coalitions can make a meaningful difference in defining the norms or the expectations of behaviors, such that, again, an adversary needs to face the prospect they need to beat all of us to beat one of us. There are so many tools that lack a connection to some larger strategy that I think that without spending another nickel, we could make a significant difference. Not being Pollyannish, it won't be perfect. There'll still be a lot of tension and chaos in that space, but I think we can go a long way.
General Clapper, what's your view on that?
Well, that's a great question. And I think there's a question about whether a private entity should have to worry about taking on a nation state. That's an issue that's worth a deeper discussion than I'm capable of. But and I think the difference here is the government has, as a part of its deterrent, offensive tools and capabilities that private companies don't or shouldn't have. And I think it's long been the view of the government that private entities shouldn't be in the attack mode, principally for the unintended consequences that could occur if they did, which is one of the reasons why even the government is pretty cautious about using offensive capabilities. So companies, in my view, need to focus on resilience. Make the assumption you're going to get attacked, and what do you do to recover? And what can you do to practice for that? And I think resilience is a key word. What can you do ahead of time, assuming you will be attacked in some way, or your data will be purloined or worse, manipulated? And so that places a premium on defenses, the latest patches, although that doesn't necessarily work either. But I think the most important thing is exercising and showing people, what vulnerabilities there are and how those are exploited, whether by nation state adversaries or individuals, criminals, hackers, whatever.
If we shift a little bit and we start thinking about what about corporate leaders, what about board members and their roles around governance? Steve, what do you think they should be doing there?
Yeah, let's get very practical about this. I think there are three things that I would be telling any board member that they need to do. The first of which is that they really need to insist on better executive support. Sometimes the support that they're getting doesn't seem to be straightforward, pragmatic, in the way that I think they should be expected to receive. And I think that independence of advice in the real world is something that sometimes that can be lacking. It's no good saying you should be doing A, B, C, and D. Board members are faced with prioritization decisions, which are really tough. And that's what they've got to focus on making. And they need to be served with good information to do that. Point number two is that we have to be really modest about that information. I think most of us have served dealing with counterterrorism and issues where we're very comfortable living in a world of imperfect knowledge and having to make decisions on the basis of dynamic, imperfect, and sometimes getting those decisions wrong. But that is the world that we now live in. And I think what I've seen, particularly I think in the financial sector, is that sometimes the sort of sense, and you've seen it with governments with COVID, that you can simply follow the science and that data analytics will give us all the answers. I think that has to be balanced with a kind of solid sense of judgment and common sense, which is born of experience and really cannot simply be taken to one side on the basis that the science, which can be very selective, tells you to do a certain thing. So I think for me, having boards that are comfortable making risk-based decisions and acknowledging that they will never be able to make those decisions on the basis of perfect knowledge, I think that's the second thing. And then thirdly, I think the financial sector is at the front. And I say it with some deference to Paddy here, because when he was in government, this was his word. But resilience, the ability to bounce back, the assumption that preventative measures will not work, I think is becoming much more central to the ways that risk is now being dealt with and threats are being addressed, which is to say a sort of scenario way of thinking that really worst case scenarios can happen. So there's a global shift at the moment in terms of trying to improve everybody's operational resilience. And it's taking probability out of the equation. It's saying assume the really bad stuff. The really bad stuff is going to happen. And let's take it from that point onwards and work out how we're going to respond. And to me, the two very practical things which I see of having most value, added value for boards, is first of all, running cyber simulations, post-incident simulations, not technical simulations, going through the technical response, but thinking about the reputational damage, thinking about insurance, thinking about interactions with law enforcement, with regulators, and so on. And that really, I think, brings home the reality to board members if it's done right. And then secondly, I think bringing in external advisors that have a very different view of the world can be really eye-opening, because in all of our worlds we can become a little bit insular, and if you're thinking about the worst cases, bringing in someone with a very different set of experiences, I think can show you a whole different and perhaps even scarier set of worst cases. But the flip side is it can also show you the good things, and I think that what I also see happening now is that as boards look at future opportunities, bringing in outside kind of individuals who are not sort of subject to the same groupthink can be really advantageous. So I think those are the three things I think in practical terms that boards are now thinking about and hopefully doing.
Well, I mean, Steve, I think you've caught something really important there. I reflect that boards are interested in this subject matter because cyber data technology issues are a hard to price risk. Yeah, that's true in the insurance market, which is why the insurance coverage is so uneven. And it's hard for boards. And what they want to do, executive leaderships and boards in particular, and audit and risk committees, is they want to get it into the position where they can manage the risk. So they want it to look a bit like in a financial institution, the way in which they deal with fraud. There is fraud, they have to manage it down, they have to have controls, but they kind of can price it. And the problem with cyber is they cannot price it. So there's a dangerous tendency then, which is to constantly try and get it under control. And Steve has said something really important, which is the role of uncertainty. And the uncertainty around and technology issues needs to be described and understood, and the limits of what can be known. And we all know that. I mean, having sat at the head of the Situation Room table in the UK, the Cobra table, and dealt with WannaCry, dealt with NotPetya, and had that experience where you're not sure what is happening, and maybe you don't know with WannaCry for 10 days exactly what is going on, and yet you have to manage through your health service being interfered with. Getting used to those levels of uncertainty is vital, but also a lot of business leaders think because they compare themselves, they have heart-to-heart chats with colleagues, they have maybe external intelligence organizations to talk to them, maybe they talk to people in Homeland Security or the National Cybersecurity Center, and they feel, therefore, that they have good situational awareness. And they don't. My experience in my private sector practice is that on the whole, when there is an intrusion, when something goes wrong, businesses only go public if they absolutely have to, if there's regulatory pressure to do so, or if it becomes public and they have to get ahead of the story. And in my experience in the last 18 months, and I looked at this recently, about that's about half to 60% of occasions, which means 40% of the time it isn't becoming public. And if it does become public, they're not explaining what really happened to them. So having a false sense of certainty about, the way you understand the world and you can get this into a box is one of the problems. And Steve has pointed that out. But also there's the point that Chris was making, which is we need a conceptual frame for this and we need to be ambitious. Now this event has a particular focus on the workforce. When I work with private equity funds looking at cyber businesses they might invest in, if the cyber business model of the model of the business we're looking at is that they are going to have many more skilled people as they grow the business, then I advise against investing in it because there isn't a constant flow, a point that Phil was making, of these highly skilled people. So if your business plan is that you're going to have more skilled people to do and you're going to have more network systems and more skilled people, it's not going to work. Which means you've got to be asking the question, how can we get out of doing a lot of the work that we currently have staff doing? How do we automate? So they've got to have a conception. But there are a couple of things. I want to just draw out one thing I think that Chris said in particular. There are a couple of things they've got to have in mind. So one of them is that at the moment, all of the drivers, if you're in business, many of the drivers, if you're in business, are to protect yourself from criminals who are attacking you for financial gain. And they tend to attack IT. Having myself sponsored an offensive cyber program in the United Kingdom, we were really interested in OT, how we could have quasi-kinetic effect. Yes, we wanted to do the other stuff too. Yes, we wanted to manage the sensibility and understanding of our opponent, but we wanted to interfere with whether some fundamental service vital to his military effort would work, which meant that we were interested in OT. The majority of cybersecurity spend at the moment is on IT, not on OT, and that's because there isn't a strong criminal driver around the OT target. It's not as strong as it is on IT, and that's a problem. That's also a problem when you look at the way in which we're expanding our attack surface. So I've been really interested in the UK, been doing some work on electronic vehicles. We're going electric in the UK, in the coming years, and we're going to have a big electric vehicle charging network. Okay, and that is being pushed out, and that's being conceptualized and pushed out. There is very little security built into that because there isn't someone. It's Chris's point, absolutely. There isn't someone saying, "Hey, we're expanding our attack surface. Best we expand our defense. Best we automate it, and not think we're going to expand our defense by having a whole load more skilled people to backfill for the task." So I think it's quite a complex area for business leaders to get their head around, and they need it laid out for them in a broader way.
If I could build on these comments on the board, I think that those are all quite valuable comments. There are two further things that I would add. One is that often in a boardroom, the lexicon is simply wrong, right? We talk about IT as if it's this special, unique kind of thing in the corner with no understanding about what its role in the business is. We've probably all been in a boardroom when somebody walks in from the information technology department and says something of the form, I need $10 million to do two-factor authentication to prevent cross-site scripting. And so the technologists need to understand that the purpose of IT is to aid and abet, sustain, extend the business. It's a business discipline. It's not just technology for its own sake. Therefore, when you ask the information technology or the operational technology crowd, what are you doing? If they tell you I'm defending IT almost for its own sake, that's the wrong answer. You have an alignment problem right up front. And so make sure that the discussion starts with, I understand what our business plan is. I understand what the role of technology is in extending and meeting those business objectives. Here's how I think we can do that. Here's what the return on that investment might be. And oh, by the way, we're going to take some risks along the way, and I need your help buying those risks down. But you start and finish with the business proposition. The second flaw that's often in these conversations is that we don't have the right expectation about what the art of the possible is. You often have folks saying, we need a secure system, as if that's possible. It's not. Right? I break your heart, but you can never have a secure system, not least of which a system that has people or doctrine involved in it. But the undulating landscape of technology alone makes that an impossibility. If you have a defensible architecture that I then need to defend, you have two benefits. One, you now have a reasonable goal that you can meaningfully attain. And two, you understand that there's a human component of the actual defense, which kind of employs agility, audacity, maneuver, those things that we're so used to in the rest of our business environment about how you take risk, how you then calculate those risks, and how you roll with the punches. Not that you want to suffer some of these pratfalls, but you will. And if you take the advice of running some exercises, you'll learn some things in the theoretical realm of kind of walking through these risks that you can then go back and buy down through your investment. But a well-defended system only builds on a defensible architecture, not a secure architecture, because the bias in thinking you have a secure architecture is you stand back and watch it do its miracles. It never will.
Well, great. Well, let's take another tack on this. One of the things I think we all agree on is the differentiator in cyber is not the product, what your location is, but the thing that really matters is talent. And talent seems to be the challenge that we hear from every executive leader in cyber, in the business, and in the government that can help us. Yet we have so many challenges around this, especially with diversity. And nothing probably is more important as we think about this than diverse thought around risk. And cyber is one of the biggest ones. So as we contemplate talent, diversity, being able to raise more risk and see things from multiple different angles and vectors, what do you think we can do, especially from the government perspective, to incubate more opportunity to drive improved cyber talent outcomes, and especially in the diversity space?
Statistically, we're short of cyber expertise. By a wide margin. And this is an issue both for the government and outside the government. One of the things I became a proponent for the last couple of years I was DNI was the intelligence community needs to foster mobility. By that I mean, if we bring young people on in the government and they do 4 or 5 years, and we ought to encourage them to go to industry to refresh, update their own technology, and then come back to the government. And instead of making it hard for people to do that, the intelligence community should be making it easy. And because I believe that many of these young people will come back to the government simply for the opportunity to serve and out of patriotism. And the institution needs to make it easy and facilitate that flow back and forth, because we're all we're not talent rich here. And by the way, this education process needs to start way early. I'm talking middle school, high school. Worrying about it at the college level is kind of late.
Well, thanks, panelists. Just unbelievable insights on a challenging topic around government and private sector partnerships. And certainly love the talent angle. It really speaks to what we're doing at the GCC around workforce development and improving cybersecurity outcomes.